So lately, this quote from Richard Garfield has been on my mind. This is a game first, and if you treat it as a collectible first, then you are not doing your game players any favors. When this idea keeps getting brought up to Mark Rosewater, either on his blog or in the podcast that he's making on his drive to work, is mostly saying that players have kind of voted with their wallets, right? That this is what the players want for Magic the Gathering. Oftentimes he cites metrics like how Spider-Man is one of the top 10 best-selling sets of all time. And it made me wonder if Magic is actually falling for one of these sort of classic traps, right? There's this idea called Goodhart's Law, which basically means that when a measure becomes a goal, it seeks to be a good measure. And so if money is the metric that Magic is using to measure its own success, it becomes just about the money. There's another beloved company that has followed a similar trajectory. Just like Magic, they have leaned into artificial scarcity and exploded their product line. And of course, they have collaborated with trending brands to try to drive demand for their own products and turn them into more valuable collectibles. The other company I'm talking about is Lego. So let's take a look at Lego and Magic together and compare them to see if we can gain an understanding for where Magic is at in terms of this transformation from being a game, in Lego's case, a toy, into being a collectible.
Distraction makers.
Way back in 2003, Lego had been battling an existential threat. It was video games. Game Boys, Tamagotchis, Nintendo, Sega, all of these companies had started to eat away at Lego's market share. They'd spent a lot of money trying to figure out how to attract buyers at that point. Their Star Wars crossover was particularly successful at that time, but they also had ventured into video games and theme parks and merchandise and a whole lot of other ideas. And this ended up resulting in over a $230 million loss for them in that year. And so in 2004, a new CEO stepped in. And his idea to save Lego and help them recover from this shortfall was twofold. One of them was what Lego calls AFOLs, which are adult fans of Lego. And they leaned heavily into this demographic because they realized it had so much untapped potential for people who had a lot of money to spend and maybe didn't have all these Lego sets when they were a kid or had nostalgia for them. And they could loop them back into the Lego ecosystem by creating products that were specifically targeted towards them. These are high dollar amount sets like Lego's Icon series, which would include the Titanic ship, which costs $680 today, the Eiffel Tower, which costs $630, and models like the Millennium Falcon that cost $850 to buy off a shelf. These are sort of essentially model kits, right? They're meant to be built once, left together to display. They just happen to be made out of Lego bricks. The second part of his strategy was FOMO. For them, this would happen on a year to 2 year basis where Lego kits like the Rancor Pit and the Simpsons house, and a lot of times special edition minifigures would come out and they'd be available for a limited time and then they would go away, and it drove fans of Lego to buy them immediately. And I'm sure at this point some of this is sounding familiar because it's basically the path that Magic has taken as well. I would argue that the collector boosters might be the least sort of problematic way that Magic has dipped its toes into this category, where mostly you're sort of separating collectors from players. And the drawback I can see with kind of the collector booster model is that you're not having collectors open a lot of packs for those chase cards in the play boosters, so that the singles market for play is being sort of subsidized by people that are seeking those collector boosters, which I think is the reason why you would want to separate these two products. It's probably part of what has contributed to singles prices rising, but also just the cost of products has gone up, so singles have followed suit. The more problematic thing that Wizards of the Coast has leaned into is Secret Lair. And again, this wouldn't be nearly as much of a problem if Secret Lair cards had stayed as sort of reskins of cards that we know from the past that have sort of alternate versions that are printed in regular Magic boosters. But as of late, Wizards has been experimenting more and more with cards coming into Secret Lair that are mechanically exclusive. They don't have an in-universe reprint of anything. This would be cards like Jaws and Gen Sakai of the PlayStation Ghost of Tsushima Secret Lair. If you were lucky enough to buy these when they were in their sort of pre-order window, I'm not sure if they had switched over to the away from the print to demand model at this point, but if you were lucky enough to get a hold of Jaws card as part of the Secret Lair pack, which you would have spent $40 on 30 or 40 or whatever it is exactly. Your Jaws Relentless Predator card at this point is worth somewhere between $116 and $157. So both of these companies have kind of leaned into artificial scarcity and sort of the collector culture of adult customers in order to raise their profit margins and move more product. None of these things particularly add to in Magic's case, none of these things really add to the gameplay of Magic. Theoretically, they should be sidelined compared to how much effort you would be spending on how good the game is. So after LEGO made these changes, it skyrocketed the company. It saved them from bankruptcy. But things became sort of turbulent again in 2017 when they had a new CEO step in. And this CEO is much more focused on ramping up the number of releases that are coming out every year and also collaborating with trending brands. So while LEGO has been collaborating with Star Wars and Marvel and a few other sort of choice companies for quite a while, this new CEO really ramped up this idea of bringing in trending brands, things like Fortnite, things like Pokemon. They also ramped up the number of LEGO sets that were coming out each year. And while this plan also worked, brought in a lot more money for LEGO and continued their upward trajectory as a company, their quality began to suffer. When you're trying to find new places to manufacture your bricks because your manufacturing capacity can't handle the number of sets that you're trying to put out, you start to see a decline in quality. Those problems can be solved, but at a certain point, LEGO also has started to look for ways to cut costs. This shows itself mostly in some of the more, the more expensive Simpsons sets, where instead of having sort of custom LEGO pieces to fit certain buildings or characters, they instead are just using stickers that are stuck to generic bricks as a way to cut costs on these sets. And of course, they still cost a lot more because it's a licensed set. So I'm sure some of this is sounding familiar because Magic the Gathering has done a very similar thing. We've ramped up from 4 sets a year to 7 sets a year. And I would wager a guess that we will probably see more sets because once Wizards of the Coast sort of did away with the block structure of having a singular plane be the theme for 3 sets in a row. Their stated reasons for doing that, this is Mark Rosewater on his podcast. Basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically is saying that the reason why they would do that is because they just didn't have enough people to build these worlds. So they're kind of stuck with doing around 4 sets a year because they see declines, right? Declines from customers. When the first set comes out, you have sort of 100%, and then the next set comes out in the block and you have 80%, and then the third set comes out and you have about 60% of the number of players that are interested at that point. I'm not going to try to argue with that idea. Of course, those blocks are declining. They tried that model for 20 years. Mark Rosewater seems to be very adamant about the fact that the block structure has been thoroughly explored and it didn't work. And again, I think we kind of come back to Goodhart's Law here, right? It's that when money is the only thing that you're measuring, which of course is important. You're a business. That's what you need to do. But I think it's easy to ignore the additional positives that we were getting from those sets. And while particularly invested players were sticking around probably through those blocks and enjoying the story, there's also sort of these design benefits to being able to stay and explore the mechanics of a world and tweak them into certain ways so that you can get the best out of them. One of the best examples was from the Mirrodin block that Mark brings up. And he basically says that Affinity, of course, was broken. We knew that. But then by the time they get to Fifth Dawn, they've kind of figured out something else to do with artifacts in Sunburst. The professor recently over at Tolarian Community College just did a video on blocks. So if you want to go more in depth on the benefits of blocks, you should check out that video. And there's another knock-on effect here, I think, in terms of getting rid of blocks. Not only did it free them up to be able to release sets more often, it also allowed them to take more risks with sets. And this is, to me, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? We got things like Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which was a return to a plane that when we first explored it was not particularly popular. And then we also got to go back to Lorwyn recently, which was another block that didn't do particularly well. And if Wizards was locked in to doing a full block of these sets, I could see why they would be hesitant to do so. So in that instance, I'm glad that we were able to do those one-off sets. But I don't really see any reason why you couldn't have it both ways, right? If you had something that you knew would be well received and hit it out of the park, maybe you can do a block at that point and get those benefits of that cohesive design, that time for things to marinate, and those be able to build up those mechanics. This also would keep things so that competitive archetypes can sort of expand over time, where now we get something like Is It Lessons or Lorwyn Elementals, where they're kind of paint by numbers, right? The cards are there, they synergize together, that's what they're good for, and they're not good for much else. The flip side of this more risky approach to being able to make Magic sets is that we get ones that are not particularly well received more often. And I think it's interesting, and I don't know exactly what things look like. Obviously, they're continuing to go down this route, so this seems to be working better for them. But if you took a particularly well-received set, something like Ravnica, and you did the block structure there, and you got 100% of Ravnica, 80% of Guild Pact, and then 60% on Dissension, was that 80 and 60 better than something like Ether Drift is now, right? Where you've taken this big risk and moved Magic outside of its sort of traditional setting to the point where people weren't all that interested. And if the only risks that you're able to take that pay off in that way are Universes Beyond risks, we're going to get into Universes Beyond in a minute, but if those are really the way that you take risks and you end up making more money, that to me is very clearly targeted towards collectors first, when some players basically say like, oh, the cards are just mechanics. I don't really care what's on the cards. I just want to play the cards. Just like Lego, Wizards of the Coast has also suffered declining quality because they're trying to push out so many sets. The clearest evidence for this is that StarCityGames.com has actually changed their criteria for what near mint means. Magic the Gathering cards printed after 2020 may have more manufacturing printing variants than other cards. Cards in near mint condition may show subtle wear. So yeah, because of these manufacturing defects and the fact that they've pushed outside of the bounds of their quality assurance, a secondary market retailer, Star City Games, has literally changed what near mint means. So finally, we get to the sort of last factor here, and that is brand collaborations. And Lego has been doing this for a very long time. It's actually part of what saved the company back in 2003. These sets at the time started as a supplementary thing, similar to Magic the Gathering, where these weren't the entirety of their product line. Gradually, they became the centerpiece, though. And I think arguably, the sort of Lego Star Wars, the more successful brand crossovers for Lego are probably some of the products that people think about first and foremost when they think about Lego, something like the Millennium Falcon. I don't know if at the time they had planned for it, but this did draw in a lot of speculators. There was a heavy collector culture associated with Star Wars memorabilia, and I do wonder if that crossover catapulted Lego into that space. And made it so that you instead, normally maybe someone would buy a Millennium Falcon kit to build and maybe display, but now they're buying multiples so that they can store several in the box, assuming that they might be worth more money down the road. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing for Lego. Obviously, model kits are cool, and building a model kit is very satisfying. For Lego is that this is an individual choice, where with Magic, it's not, right? If I want to participate in a standard tournament, I must engage with their version of this, which is Universes Beyond. If I'm playing in a commander group, I will see Spider-Man or soon Marvel, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that another player is playing. And it's not that I don't accept that they want to do that. That's totally fine. That's just not something I necessarily want to participate in. And at that point, it makes it so that Magic is not necessarily for me. So in a very similar way to how this unfolded with Lego, we're seeing it unfold with Magic as they sort of tipped their toe into this space with the Godzilla cards in Ikoria and the Walking Dead Secret Lair. After not all that much time, it has sort of become the centerpiece of Magic. This year alone, 4 of the 7 sets that are being released are Universes Beyond sets. Part of the unlock for them here was in how do they produce more sets? If producing more sets just gets them more money, how do they do that when their resources to build worlds is expensive and they have to ramp that up? Well, instead, you can spend probably less money comparatively, bring in these outside IPs, and then you can raise the price of the product, which is offsetting that cost, maybe 100%, who knows? And then customers end up wanting to buy this not because it makes the game any better necessarily, but because it makes the game more appealing to collectors. And I think that sort of creates this negative reinforcement loop where you have collectors buying more of these products if Spider-Man is one of the top 10 best-selling sets of all time, and anecdotally game stores have overstock of it still, who's buying that product? Is it the people going to the game stores to play the game? Or is it people who are going to their local Walmarts or Targets or wherever, or even online to buy this product to speculate on it? Once that sort of becomes the feedback loop, right? When we have Goodhart's Law coming into play here, where the only metric they're measuring is not how good the game is, it's how much money the game is making. This is the path to more money, right? Is that you create a collectible that people want to buy multiples of, thinking that it'll be worth something more later. So let's just sort of wrap things up here. Lego, has gone down a very similar path that Magic seems to be going down, and it worked for them for many years. I do think that there's some pretty key differences between these two products, though. Lego is individual. Lego is opt-in that you get to sort of choose which products you want to buy, and they didn't delete old products. They didn't delete their more basic or more creatively inclined products when they made these new ones. They continued doing all of these things. There wasn't an override of what had came before. It was additive. Where Magic has forced players into these changes. If you want to play Standard, you have to play with Universes Beyond cards. They removed the draft boosters so that now you have play boosters, and that arguably hurt limited play. They removed the block structure, which I think heavily invested players liked a lot. That 60% of players that was sticking around in that third set of the block, those were the people that were invested enough to be paying attention. And while, the first new set that came out in that plane, I think was a really good indicator to players that, hey, we're in a totally new place now, and maybe that's part of the block problem, is that more casual, less invested players would basically not understand that a new set had come out because it looked too similar. I'm not faulting Magic for moving away from the block system. I think that obviously they tried it for a long time, and moving away from it has been extremely successful for them. But I do wish that they would at least acknowledge that there were some advantages to the system for the game's design, even if sales-wise it wasn't the most successful thing for them to do. I am still curious about whether or not a third set in a block would have done better than Ether Drift, though. I'm sure a third Bloomburrow set would have done better than Ether Drift. I'm left sort of nostalgic for Magic's past, and what it makes me wonder about is when your product, whatever it is, becomes just a vehicle for other brands that people have nostalgia for, how do they then become nostalgic for your product? How do you build that customer investment when they're only here for something else that you're offering? And I would assume that most of the designers at Wizards of the Coast think that players are here because Magic is so mechanically unique and interesting and such a great game. But I think only time will tell how many of those players are really going to stick around. When Magic's previous customer life cycle was 7 years, you had players that would stick around for 7 years. And I wonder if that timeline has shrunk, and whether or not the players that used to stick around for 7 years are going to stick around through this vastly different time for Magic the Gathering. So that's it. That's all I have to say for this one. Let me know what you think in the comments. I found the comparison with Lego to be very interesting, and that I think Magic is on a very similar path. Like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to continue the conversation, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.